All right, welcome back to the Zeitgeist podcast. Today, we've got another guest with us. We've got Dr. Rupa Gill, known to us as Rupa. She's one of our... Rupa! She's one of our fellow co-residents. If you guys are new to
She's
this...
our subordinate.
We can put it that way. I was just about to get to that part. If you're new to this show, Dr. Noone, myself, we're both third-year residents now, and Rupa is a lowly second-year resident. I'm sorry, Rupa.
We
It's
make
okay.
her do all of our work.
Happy to be a second year
We
resident.
appreciate that, and we appreciate you coming on the show. Thank you, Rupa. All right, so today, you said you want to talk about loneliness, right?
Yes.
All right, what's going on, Rupa? What what put that on your mind?
I just think that, with the growing social media craze and, mental health being at the forefront of conversations more so than it ever was before, I think one of the things that I've noticed in the last year is that to some degree, everyone has experienced a time of loneliness.
Mm-hmm.
And what does that really do to us? What really kind of got me in this was the connection of loneliness and its effect on your physical health. There's really interesting stats that we can get into later, but that was kind of like my gateway into we should probably talk about this.
Okay, how about right now? I want to hear those numbers. That sounds interesting.
So it's just to start off first, there's studies that show that loneliness can be equivalent to smoking cigarettes every day.
15 cigarettes.
15
I don't know if we
cigarettes,
looked at the
yeah.
same study.
15
Yeah.
cigarettes every single day?
Yes.
That's what it's...
Golly.
Did you look at one at a BYU? That's where I found this one.
I found this on the APA website.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Hey, two different sources. We know it's real.
Right.
So 30% increase in a risk of stroke or development of coronary artery disease. And then, just like things where like tangible medical problems that I was like, oh, wow, like we've never really thought of that as a risk factor, especially when we're on medicine months in a residency. So yeah, those were kind of the shocking, kind of bigger ones that I saw.
Yeah, to kind of piggyback on that, I also found some stats on loneliness is associated with a 40% increase in the risk of dementia, which made like kind of total sense to me. It's like, if you're not using your cognitive abilities in conversation like we are right now, it's like, what does that do to your actual cognitive ability? Like if you're interacting with nobody, it's like, can you really literally lose your mind? Like dementia, it's really kind of scary to think about. What I also kind of found interesting in this is that social isolation and loneliness are not necessarily like the same thing, and like they're not always correlated. Like, did you find that?
Wait, how
Yeah.
so? Can you explain that to me?
Well, so social isolation is more of an objective measure, and loneliness is the subjective feeling of being
Oh,
isolated.
Yeah.
interesting. So what exactly qualifies as social isolation?
I don't know if there's necessarily a universal study
like
in-
DSM criteria.
Right.
Yeah.
In various, like in this one page, I'm looking at Tulane University. It says social isolation. I can't even talk. Social isolation is an objective lack of social relationships or infrequency of social contact. So kind of vague, like who, interpret that as you will. Loneliness is a subjective feeling of isolation. So like a person can be socially isolated but not feel lonely. And a person can feel lonely when they are surrounded by people. So
I've experienced that actually. I
Right.
went to undergrad at NYU, and you would think that in an undergrad where there is thousands of kids living in New York City, that you would never feel alone. I lived with roommates, but I would say about second year into undergrad, I probably felt the most. That was my first experience feeling the most isolated I've ever had. It just felt like people and everyone were kind of in their own little auras. Everyone's racing to get to the next goal. Ambition was taken over. And while we were physically present with each other, our minds weren't there. And that was my first bout with loneliness, especially leaving home and stuff like that. But I thought that was interesting when they made that distinction in the study that I made as well too. That's how I explain it. You feel lonely in a city full of people.
Being lonely in a crowded room, right? Like that old saying, that's the worst type of loneliness that you can experience. So I'm sorry you went through that, Rupa. And, I think there's many people out there that can relate to your experience because it's, it's really an epidemic. It's the rates of loneliness amongst all age demographics are rising. So honestly, I wouldn't be surprised with the next iteration of the DSM-6. Maybe there will be a criteria for social isolation. Maybe there will be some more descriptions regarding loneliness. That's how heavy I feel like this issue is becoming in our society. I can remember back in the days when I was a pre-med student and I was shadowing, trying to gain experience, trying to get into med school. It would be, I would come across that patient, that elderly patient in a primary care setting that seemingly had no medical issues, but they would present to the clinic almost on a daily basis. Mm-hmm. And we kind of chalked that up to loneliness. So that kind of got me interested in thinking about, especially within elderly populations, the rates of loneliness and the physical impacts and the emotional impacts that people in that demographic oftentimes experience. But now it's getting to the point where I feel like the conversation, and there's so much social media news about these days, is young people. Right. Young people are dealing with increasing rates of loneliness to an unprecedented degree. And I think some of that, just to piggyback off your story, Rupa, I think some of that has to do with the type of environment that we're living in, right? Traditionally speaking, we were more, human history, we were more communal, right? We had core communal groups. Civic activity, people used to be involved in a lot more. So interestingly enough, since the 1950s, the rates of civic participation within the United States and social engagement has been dropping precipitously, right? A generation or two ago, people would live out in smaller communities. They would attend church. They would maybe volunteer together. They would participate in their local politics. And it's a completely different picture today. And the point that I'm getting at with your story, Rupa, is the setting, right? We've gone from where a majority of our citizens lived in small, tight-knit suburban communities to where people are congregating more and more into these big cities, right? So NYU, heart of New York City, right? Manhattan. So in a setting like that, I grew up in New York City, right? So I know what you're talking about. It's like I think about my childhood home. I lived there since I was in 6th grade, probably definitely till the time I left for college. And I had a lot of neighbors, right? There's apartments all around. There's multi-story complexes all around. And none of us knew each other. Yeah. And just contrasting this experience with, I remember on one of our other episodes on South Korea, you asked me about my experience in Seoul, and we were talking about how dense it is and how many people there are within such a small amount of space. And I think it kind of ties in together. It seems like the bigger the city, the more people congregate together in that specific area. Oddly enough, paradoxically, it seems like the more disconnected people feel from one another.
Right. Yeah. And there's actually one thing, I'm really glad you kind of brought up a concept of church. I was looking at this one study that was out of University of Maryland's Do Good Institute. And it was talking about the rates of, like you said, volunteerism have also decreased. And it really kind of talked a lot about how there's an increasing percentage of Americans specifically who report no religious affiliation, suggesting declines in that kind of religious and other institutional connections that can provide some sense of community. And it really had me kind of thinking a lot because, in my personal kind of experience, I've kind of gone through this journey of being associated with the Christian methodology and actually attending church with my family to like staunch atheist for a while. And who knows exactly where I stand now? I don't necessarily go to church, but am I an agnostic person, spiritual person? Who knows? I guess I'm still kind of figuring that out. But one thing that I truly do miss about actually going to church was that kind of sense of community. Like you had people that in your normal day-to-day life, you probably would have no means of connection with. And like you didn't really have nothing really in common besides believing that there was a second coming of Jesus, right? Or who knows, right? And it's weird, and I do yearn for that. And one thing that I do try to advocate for, to anyone out there who does feel lonely, because it's helped with me is finding sport, right? And that's why I think sports in some regard can bring people together. And most specifically, sports that can be played at really any age in some regard. And like golf is one of my favorites. And golf is one of the few times that I've been involved with individuals of all ages. And surprisingly, what I'm kind of finding now is also even like surfing is that, which I didn't really realize. like there's, when I go out there surfing, at least on those small waves, there's some dudes that are like twice my age who are ripping it. It's so inspiring, and it gives me that kind of connection that I had in church in some ways, that here I am talking to this 70-year-old person. We're not talking about work. We're talking about this like shared love. And is being out there in those waves, is that like an experience of church and spirituality? Sorry, I could rant forever about this, but I'm really glad you kind of brought up the interconnection between church and loneliness.
And I'm glad you brought up what you said, because from what you tell me, my reaction is, wow, Logan is somebody that lives with intention. And I say that because I feel like one of the biggest issues that's contributing to the rising rates of loneliness in our country is that people don't have the leeway to live their lives with intention anymore. We kind of touched upon this when we had that hustle culture episode, right? And there's research that says that people, especially young men who grow up in more individualistic societies, tend to experience loneliness more viscerally and at higher rates. And I take that to mean, look, just open social media, right? You see the glamour. You feel like there's pressure to make money, economically successful, and that's what brings you happiness, right? And we're all in pursuit of this goal, right? We want to look good for other people. We want to show that we're successful. But look at the reality of our economy, right? Things are tough. Things are tough for a lot of people out there. And being so caught up in that hustle culture, let alone just trying to survive for the vast majority of Americans out there today, unfortunately, I think people just come home, they're tired, and they unfortunately don't have the energy to live their lives with that sort of intention, because that's what really takes, right? When you talk about community, when you talk about volunteerism, civic service, and these groups that you're talking about, you have to intentionally put yourself out there and put in that effort and energy. And I think a lot of people today just don't have the leeway to exert that sort of effort to that end, unfortunately. And that's a very difficult situation to be in, because what the hell do you do, right? You have to survive. You got to pay rent. You got to put food on your table, and everything kind of falls secondary to that. And I think this loneliness epidemic that we're dealing with is largely a byproduct of that.
Also, a couple things that you had mentioned, social media, everything's glamorized. I think a lot of times we find ourselves, scrolling for 5, 6, 7 hours a day on these social media websites, and they're really good at targeting, giving you content that is your interest, right? So like for me, for instance, I love baking. I'll see a ton of stuff that's baking, and and I'll be like, oh, I really want to do that. But if I'm scrolling through the 2 hours after I have on work, just watching it, I feel like that incentive to actually go and do it is kind of gone. I also think that a lot of the younger generation, when they see all this glamour on TikTok, it almost creates such a negative mindset in themselves, because like you said, they haven't achieved it, and they just think that everything is easy and that they need to be this ideal beauty, or they need to do, whatever it may be. And then that causes a lot of negative thought in them, and which encourages them almost to kind of continue to self-isolate, because they start questioning, are they worthy to go and present themselves in society? One of the articles that I had read, they said that maybe one way to combat loneliness on an individual level is actually CBT, to combat those negative thoughts and kind of going away from self-isolating because you just think that you're not worthy enough, and going forward and being able to manage and cope with that all that stuff that social media is kind of like throwing at you all the time. So I thought that was interesting, because when I think loneliness, I'm not really going straight to like, oh, let me go do CBT because I'm lonely. That certainly was not my first impression when I was at NYU. Like, let me get therapy for this. But it makes a lot of sense. The more that we talk down on ourselves, which is very easy to do when you do in social media, and also social media takes your incentive away to actually put yourself out there and do the things you love. It makes sense that therapy would help with that.
Yeah, I think one of the things that don't get mentioned enough about when we talk about social media and the effect on loneliness is, look, social media at the end of the day, we can argue that it's a giant ad. Yeah. Right? They're trying to sell you products. Right. Yeah. And we live in a very materialistic, consumer-oriented society. And we're all chasing, for me, like I'm a watch guy. I love watches. So, I'm chasing that watch and I only have so much time in my day. And oftentimes we can fall into this pattern where we're so fixated on getting that next product that we can, post a picture of on Instagram that we forget. We forget that what really makes life worth living is the relationships that we have. And those relationships, we talked about intentionality before, right? They require your attention, they require your time, and they require your commitment. And that endless chase for materialistic goods can kind of take the focus away from that. So that's one thing I wanted to point out. But Rupa, there's something that I really wanted to ask you. All right, so I'm gonna do it right now. All right, so this is gonna be like a cultural question because, and let me know if this is something that you don't feel comfortable talking about on a podcast. But you've mentioned to me that your family comes from like a little village in India, or there's a village that you like always go back to in India. Mm-hmm. All right, so one of the issues with loneliness, one of the biggest contributing factors that we alluded to earlier is this concept of urbanization, right? People are leaving those villages and coming to like bigger cities. So you had the unique experience of spending significant amount of time throughout, your entire life, presumably, experiencing both these big metropolitan cities, but also the traditional and the more culturally oriented village life. Right. So can you give us a little bit more insight? Like what is it like and what are the differences between these two settings?
So, yeah, I'm happy to talk about it. So we come from a little town called Maluka. It's a small village. My family they're farmers. So pretty much around our little village is just farmland. And let's just start off in the morning. We wake up in the morning. Every time I'm there, we wake up around 5, 6 a.m. There is a big speaker in the town center. It's, the church, our version of priests kind of making announcements in the morning about the news, kind of updating everyone and then having a prayer on, right? And then around 6 a.m., we all get together around a small fire pit and we have our morning tea. Everyone, our grandparents that are like 80-year-olds to our like my cousins that are like 10 years old. We start the day that early. And we start just talking to each other around the small fire pit. And then pretty much everything that we do and every neighbor that we know them by name. We know their kids. I don't even spend that much time in India, unfortunately, because we're here. But every time I go back, I still have all these relationships that my family back in India has continued for years. So I can kind of pick up right where I started with like my friends in India. It's just a whole different world. And I also think that one of the big things is we don't have like a lot of places don't have Wi-Fi there. So we're not on the phone. So we are forced to go outside and we walk around the farmland. We go in literally on our tractors and say hi to other people that are farming around, It's just, it makes us one with nature and with each other, and we're present and we're there. And I don't think to emulate that kind of sense of peace right now and where I'm living and, where I've been in the States, I can't. Is
loneliness an issue there?
I think far less than here.
Are people generally happier there?
I think I'm not going to speak on that because I think there is a whole different thing of stigma around mental health and talking about depression and stuff there, which, I can't give you accurate numbers. But do I think people there feel like they have a sense of community and people they can turn to? Absolutely. I think that sometimes even here, one of the questions I wanted to pose to you guys is, do you think our generation or or even our generation, the generations lower than us, do you think people have become more selfish and have kind of become so introverted that they kind of forget or they don't even know like the untapped potential of having a better community and stronger social network?
I think more than selfishness, the word that comes to mind is hubris. And I say that because, I imagine myself asking a typical American teenager, right? Do you want this life in Rupa's little village? Right? Where you wake up at 6 a.m., you're a farmer, but you have this sense of community, you have this sense of well-being. And you have no Wi-Fi. Now you're going to lose like everybody there, right? Like how many people, TikTok. Exactly. How many American teenagers or Americans in general are signing up for that kind of life? I would argue not very many. And I think that comes from, there's a sense that we have it all figured out, right? If I get X watch, if I can wear X brand, wear the latest Jordans, this is what's going to make me happy. And we forget that there's so much more to life than just the materialistic goods than what we see on social media. And the hubris comes in where we're kind of dismissive of the alternative lifestyles. These lifestyles that people have lived for essentially the entirety of our history, right? And I don't know entirely, I'm not sure where that kind of perception comes from. Maybe it's a byproduct of living in a bubble, as we're all susceptible to, right? You spend enough time in America and America just seems like it's the rest of the world, right? There's nothing beyond our American borders, it seems like. And what the American culture tells us is the key to happiness seems like it's the one and only answer, it's the only truth. But in reality, there's so many other alternative lifestyles where different places where you can put your values that can potentially improve the sense of your well-being.
Yeah. I feel like, I feel like in the last couple of years, especially med school was very isolating, and a time where I also felt lonely in certain periods, right? And in residency, you kind of say that, oh, I've achieved my goal of becoming a doctor. Those feelings still persisted. I always thought that in med school I felt lonely because you're just overwhelmed with work. But, I definitely felt like in residency, I still had my moments of loneliness. And then I asked myself why. I think as we get older, I don't know if you guys feel this, but our social networks keep dwindling. And that might be kind of maybe unique to us because we're in the medical field. We change from undergrad, we go to somewhere else for medical school, then we go somewhere else for residency. But I feel like retaining the amount of friends that maybe we had in high school, it just keeps dwindling every stage of our life until we kind of have our own family. And then we'll have like one or two friends that we're really, really close to and have meaningful relationships, And I wonder, is that sometimes I ask myself, is it me? Again, those negative thoughts come back. Is it me that people aren't sticking around? Is it a product of just like human nature that people are going to fend for themselves and again, be selfish and, take care of their own needs before they come and help you or reach out to you or make those plans with you? Or, is it three? It's just not feasible? Is it not feasible to have a big social network? And is it necessary to have that big social network anymore? Those are all questions I kind of have, I was a sociology major in full disclosure at NYU. So I guess these questions kind of had started at that time, but it really hits home when it's you, in every stage of your life, irrespective of where I've been, I've definitely had those periods of loneliness. So like, it's very difficult to wonder, is the only thing that was consistent amongst all those periods was me, right? And it comes back to like, again, those negative thoughts. Like, is my social network just not big because people just maybe aren't vibing with me? Which I think you guys would find a little interesting because I tend to be kind of one of the louder residents and the one that's always trying to organize everyone to stay together and stuff like that. But it is very real in that, like things that I've experienced. So,
well, I kind of think a lot about how, we all have different personality types, right? Like, so little window into my life with my wife. I'm very much an extrovert, right? I get energy out of being with people. And my wife is very much extroverted in some ways, but has, I think, sometimes more introverted characteristics, right? And so that's what made me think a lot about in this study. Like, social isolation and loneliness are not equally, like, perfectly correlated. Like, we all have different preferences. And like, I for me, it's like honoring that need also for social isolation. I can barely say that word on this episode. But like going and doing things that I just want and being like that meditative practice, but also the yin and yang of life, like honoring also the other side of trying to combat that loneliness and engage with other people. And I think that respecting that everybody does have different preferences and a different balance, a different yin and yang to their life. And when you were talking right there, it just kind of had me thinking a lot about like the Bob Marley song, like good friends you've had, good friends you've lost, right? And as I've kind of aged through life, I've had, very, very different upbringing to you, but like, I grew up in an extremely small town where it's like, I can't even really remember making friends, is that they were always there. I went through the same, basically through kindergarten all the way through high school with the same group of people. So it's like, I feel like I didn't really make friends. Like they were just there. Like, of course, friends developed, of course, with time naturally, but I had decades around those people. Then moving into a new place like California, I definitely felt very lonely. And one hurdle I had to get over in my personal life, it's being like assertive with friendships, like going up to a fellow, I mean, typically it's dudes, right? For me, whatever. And being like, hey, like, I want to hang out. Can I get your number? And I had these own kind of negative thoughts, like, is this guy going to think I'm hitting on him? Like, this is not romantic. This is not sexual. I was just trying to hang out, like, be friends. And like this weird construct. And as I've learned to evolve, and of course, I haven't gotten perfect with it at time, but, you know, like I have been trying to get more assertive, that realizing that, look, I live in Philadelphia. I'm not necessarily physically close to any of those friends that I had from growing up that have always been there, like my brothers. And I do have to be assertive with making those friendships. So, you know, we're all doctors here. So I'm very curious. You know, I kind of think of this like, you know, when we have a patient who comes in who's overweight and we're like, yeah, you should exercise. And they're like, well, no shit. I thought of that. Like, yeah. And that's how I kind of think of this situation. Like a patient comes in and tell us they're lonely. It's like, oh, you should make friends. Like, oh shit. Like, why didn't I think of that? Like, you know, like, thanks for the great fucking suggestion. Here's your copay, asshole. Like, so how do we actually help people out with loneliness? Like, how do you think you would try to meaningfully teach someone how to get over those automatic negative thoughts that you described, that I described? Like, so Joon, I guess I'll kick it to you first. Like, how would you actually try to help someone in this situation?
With the recognition that I can only do so much, I think our role as physicians is one of educators. So I'd be very frank with them. I mean, a lot of the things that we talked about on this podcast, right? We've just been talking about how important that sense of community is. And I would talk to that person about like, hey, some of these negative emotions you're feeling, certainly medications can help with that. But ultimately, like, what is at the root cause that's making you feel this way? Is it loneliness? Do you lack a sense of community? Is that something you're longing for? Do you think that will make a difference? And oftentimes I hear patients say yes, but they don't want to do the work of developing that community. And I don't blame them, right? Because it's very difficult.
There's no pill for friendship.
Yeah, it's very, very difficult. And you alluded to this earlier, Rupa. I mean, as we age, it seems like friendships are just harder and harder to develop, especially the intimate ones that we crave.
Yeah.
So I don't think there's a good answer there, Logan. But I think I would encourage them more towards maybe even like volunteerism. Just get out there, you know, just interact with people. Like, when you first get out there, it doesn't even necessarily have to be the development of very deep connections, right? Sometimes just if you've been just sitting at home for the past month, just step out to your local grocery store, say hello to the cashier. Even those little seemingly trivial human interactions can have a very positive impact on your mental health. And just like with any other mental illness, it's, you know, you just got to continue to do the work and build that positive momentum. And then one day you're going to hit that threshold and you're going to look back and you're going to be grateful for all the great relationships and the memories that you've developed during that time.
Yeah. What would you say?
I think I would kind of make them feel, my patient, I would let them know that it's not just to them, like that everyone kind of feels this. I would try to first validate what they're feeling. Because I think having that open, you know, sometimes I've done this, you know, with some of our more depressed patients that I've seen, is to be like, hey, I understand what you're feeling, right? Loneliness and finding friends is really difficult. And I think just making it a safe space for them to talk to, because if I do make that safe space for us as their physician, at the very least, I know whenever they come back, they will feel like they can talk to me. That's one more person that they can confide in and trust. Maybe that make them feel a little less lonely. I think a lot of times, a lot of, you know, disconnect between people that happens is because we just don't communicate. We don't really listen. We'll talk, but we don't listen to each other. We don't really take that time. And I think that, you know, we see it all the time when we're talking to each other and someone's like on their phone texting, and you can tell that they're not listening to you, and it's not a great feeling. So really taking that even 5 minutes of just unsolicited, not getting bothered time and listening, and really just validating my patient's pain or loneliness, that would be my first step, and let them know that it's not unique to them, and a lot of people are feeling that way, and then go on to, like, you know, solutions maybe. One of the things that one of the articles said for me was that I read was that why don't we start earlier in childhood? In schools, teachers should encourage all their elementary age kids, if they see someone sitting alone, like encourage them to go and bring them into their group. And, we can't expect children to naturally do that. That's maybe a learned behavior that is taught at home or it's not. But if we have people like educators and again, like physicians and all that stuff, encouraging kids at a very young age to like not let anyone else feel othered, those are the habits you're going to go and, kind of have throughout your life. So that would be my answer.
Yeah, I guess my answer would be, I talk a lot about with my patients, I don't try to talk necessarily about religion, but the concept of like, okay, well, what is your spirit? What is your soul? Like, and what I try to really teach, it's like, for me, like soul and spirit is, what is an activity that you find in your life when you do it, you don't think about anything. You can find that flow state of consciousness where you're just, that's who you are. All you do is appreciate that moment. For my personal life, Joon, like with you, right? Like, I think we developed a friendship because in that one point of time when we were both playing basketball with all of our other now friends, who we can call them, our souls, our spirits were all in that moment. And that's how I feel like friendships can be born and develop. And I feel like getting in touch with our soul, with our spirit, and trying to honor that and realize like, hey, look, Rupa, you love baking and that kind of things. Like, how can we turn that activity away from you just cooking alone in your room, in your kitchen, to cooking with others, teaching others, or maybe volunteering, like you were saying. For me, I like to think a lot about this concept of like exercise and sport and bringing people together, because it's been so beneficial to my life. And we've talked about on other episodes how, likely these people who are feeling lonely are also depressed. Exercising can help with depression, and maybe it can also help bring people together in friendship as well.
Logan, oddly enough, when I have patients talk to me about loneliness, one of the common themes that I've encountered is incomplete family structure. I'll just put it that way. Maybe that's not an adequate explanation, but what I essentially mean is, their core relationships are not ideal. And I think, just culturally, there's been a shift, a radical shift, when you compare it to how the nuclear family structure has been perceived for essentially all of human history. We live in an era now where it's a completely different perception, right? The family dynamic has changed so much in such a short amount of time. And I think a lot of people are struggling to deal with that. So one of the interesting things that I found was that when I think about like my grandparents' generation, right? And I'm going to bring you into this because I think there's going to be a lot of cultural overlap between my experience as a Korean American and your experience as well. So, traditionally in the Korean culture, the firstborn son is responsible for taking care of the parents in their elderly age. So what does that really mean? That means there's, they're expected to live with them.
Yeah.
Right. In fact, so Rupa, fun fact about me, I also come from a village.
Oh.
Yeah.
All this time and you
South
never,
Korea.
you just listen to my stories.
Well, I can trace my lineage back to a village. I should put it that way. Because I was born in a big city. This urbanization process has already taken place and it's taken my parents from their native village into a bigger city where I was born.
Yeah.
But there's this village that I can go back to and there's actually like generations of people from my family and all their grave sites are there. They have a big plot of land that's been handed down to their firstborn son. And even if you weren't the firstborn son, all of your siblings, all of your uncles, aunts, they all essentially grew up and stayed in that same village. So in their old age, we had a lot of people, that are looking out for them. They still had that sense of community. But today, right? Like, I don't know, do you want to live with your parents when you get married? Like we have a very visceral reaction to that at least you're in the West, right? I saw that look on your face, Rupa. So maybe you don't completely agree with that. So what's up?
I think that, I will say, again, my family they immigrated here. My parents did. So they kind of they're teetering that line of like the old school. I know that parts of them still yearn to go back to that village and live there. I think I was, and you probably maybe agree with this, but I was very fortunate that our parents took those values of community and kind of tried to put it into our daily life. So all of my first eight of us, first cousins, we all lived a mile apart. So our parents kind of kept us very close. I think in doing that, it was great because throughout grade school, high school, you kind of always have, like Logan had earlier said, you have friends there and you have your network there. But I will say one thing that I've noticed is that as we've all grown, we didn't all grow together. Our values, our beliefs, they kind of all changed. And at times we had miscommunication or disagreements on certain things and we grew apart. I almost beg to differ that having that experience might have created or added to the loneliness that I felt, right? Because you have this amazing support group for your entire life. And then all of a sudden, much like our parents had to do from they're going from their support group and then moving here, it all dissipates. And then you feel that loneliness even more because that anchor is not there anymore. I guess time will tell. I think relationships are always transient and changing. So, I'm sure a lot of and in due time, families and friends that, those relationships are never linear. And I think acknowledging that is one big thing to also combat loneliness. It's not a you problem. It's just that people change, times change, our responsibilities, our goals, it's just, that's human nature as well. So I think that's one thing. But yeah. Anything that you have to add to that, Joon?
Well, I think that's a great point. At the core of it, what I'm sensing is that you feel like at the core of emotional well-being and at the core of feeling like we're connected to a community is that relationship with your immediate family members, knowing that people are there no matter what happens to support you.
Yeah.
And look, the story that I told, I was referring more to our parents' generations, right? Okay. Both of our parents are first generation immigrants. Right. And we know that marginalized communities, LGBTQ, other minorities, including immigrant populations, are more susceptible and deal with loneliness at higher rates.
Yeah.
And I think some of that has to do with, being taken away from, for my dad, that village that he grew up in. And, he left the country. He hasn't seen he sees his siblings maybe once every 5 years if he's lucky.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's a very different and isolating experience for a lot of immigrant individuals out there. But Rupa, when we're talking about, having that, that story about you going to New York and, you still knew that a short drives away, you still had that community, that family. Support. You had your mom, dad, your other siblings.
Yeah.
But this is what I worry about, Rupa, especially when it comes to our young women in our communities. So I don't know if you guys have heard this statistic thrown out there before, but 45% of women are expected to be single and childless by 2030.
Yep. I've heard that. Know. It's very, very much in the forefront of my thoughts. Yes.
Yep. Logan, first time hearing that. What are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, going through this is, I guess it kind of just makes sense because I was reading about how there's a decreased rates of marriage, of having children. I wasn't necessarily looking at women specifically because it's if those women are not married and not having kids, there's also equal amount of not fathers out there who are men who are probably single too, right? It's just really unfortunate. And also, I just wanted to add on one other point. You touched upon, immigrants and marginalized group of people, LGBT, people of color. But also, one thing this Tulane University highlighted, and it really had me think about your dad, being old is also a risk factor for loneliness. Yeah. Older adults often live alone. Hearing and vision issues can also even contribute to social isolation. I can't say this word. let's just end the podcast there. You know what I'm trying to talk about. But yeah, maybe lack of being able to walk around, lack of driving, and then of course adding in that hearing and vision, not even being able to see necessarily the person who's speaking with you. It's scary to think about. We're all young here talking about this, but realizing that just being old alone, Uncle Joe Biden must be lonely up there, bro. It's tough. We've been chatting for 39 minutes. Let's what are your final thoughts, Rupa, that you would, if someone out there, if you want to just try to give them any last words of advice, what would you try to give them?
I think make yourself vulnerable. Put yourself out there. I think that's the only really thing that you can do if you want to combat loneliness in acutely. I think, we can't rely on bigger systemic changes. You just got to be vulnerable and really try to find people that you connect with, whether it be through sport, whether it's, going to therapy first, but also not to lose like pretty much hope. Like you're not always like, loneliness is not going to be a constant state. That's what I would say. Mm-hmm. I think loneliness is just temporary, and there is very actionable ways that you can get yourself out of it. And I think that's what I would let someone leave someone with.
Well, what should we say to an individual who feels so disenfranchised by society, who's going through such a financial struggle that they need to work 2 jobs just to make ends meet? They come home, they're tired, they can't do anything else. So they don't necessarily have the time or the energy to develop these relationships, and they feel trapped. They envision the future, and they can't see a future where they'll be able to get a job that's high paying enough that they're only able to have 1 job. They can't see a position where they'll be able to have the leeway and the time to develop, maybe even romantic relationships, to have hope for a family one day. And I think it's a situation that, unfortunately, too many, especially young Americans, are finding themselves in today. And I really worry about the future implications, right? These people are maybe in their late teens, early 20s right now. Well, what does the world look like in 10 years, right? 45% of women are expected to be single and childless. Also, vice versa. Men are also dealing with high rates of, not being able to sustain relationships, and reporting higher rates of loneliness as well. So what does that really bode for the future? I don't think there's a clear answer as of right now, but if I had to take a guess, I'm not very optimistic. And I don't know. I hate to take away from the positive notes.
All right, so I guess our first patient we're going to help is Joon.
Yeah,
I need some optimism.
Hey, Joon, you can talk to me.
Okay, you can pass the ball, Joon. I got you. Okay, so here's my words of advice. Here's my words of advice. And I feel like I've... maybe it's been a skill. I mean, you guys know me. I'm like gregarious at baseline, right? I'm a chatty Cathy. But in my periods of depression, when I know I'm depressed, is when I actually choose to start to self-isolate. And I don't even necessarily always feel lonely, but I start to put myself in socially isolative situations, and I don't engage with friends. And like that's when I can actually sense my depression coming on again, which for me with bipolar disorder, it definitely is there. I did a whole presentation on this, a couple of weeks ago, right? I'll do an episode on it. But, what I've learned, it's you have to be assertive and realize that loneliness and social isolation, there, I said it right finally, are not perfectly correlated, right? Like you can still feel you can still feel lonely even if you have people all around you. Like Rupa was talking about, she grew up in that area of Jersey where she had a ton of cousins and friends and all these people that she's grown up with forever. But you can still feel lonely in that environment. I've tried to really think about this a lot in more recently, right? I moved to Jersey. You were new to this region too. And thankfully we were able to develop a great friendship through our work, through basketball. But now it's been really nice, through my surfing endeavors here. I've really been trying to be super aggressive with making friends out there and realizing like, hey, look, I'm lonely, or I don't say I'm lonely necessarily. It's like, hey, I'm new to this sport. I don't know anybody who goes surfing. Like, can we go surfing together sometime? And I've made friends that way, and it's been really refreshing to interact with individuals in the society that maybe I wouldn't have before. And like I was kind of talking about earlier in the podcast, like maybe that's my church, like being out there in a shared love of a sport that we can all take in together, build some kind of sense of community. So I guess you got to start surfing, Joon. This is what I'm saying. Yeah.
Or join the baking club.
I'm picturing you aggressively trying to make friends on a beach.
Yeah. They're like, hey, dude, you don't even go for that wave.
just talking the entire time. Yeah.
All right. I think that's a good place to end it. Let's do it. Like and subscribe.
Thanks for tuning in, everyone.
Yeah.
And Rupa, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me. It was a great time.
Absolutely.